James Eaton Legg hooked his heels over the rounds of his high stool, stretched wearily, and looked out through the none too clean windows to where a heavy fog almost obscured the traffic. Heavy trucks lumbered past, grinding harshly over the cobbles. Somewhere, a streetcar motorman did a trap drum effect on his gong. A ferry boat whistled boomingly, and there was the incessant roar of everyday noises of the commercial district. James Eaton Legg was not a prepossessing person. He was less than 30 years of age, slightly beneath medium height, slender. His face was thin, rather boyish, his mild blue eyes hidden behind a pair of glasses. His mouth was wide, and when he yawned wearily, he showed a good set of teeth. For several years, James had been a bookkeeper with Mellon and Company, wholesale grocers, San Francisco, and he was still acting in the same capacity. His slightly stooped shoulders attested to the fact that James had bent diligently over his work. Whether fortunately or unfortunately, James was an orphan. His mother had died while he was still very young, and when James had just finished high school, his father had gone the way of all flesh. James was cognizant of the fact that somewhere in the world he had some relatives, but the fact caused him little concern. He remembered that his mother had a sister who was well endowed with worldly goods, and he also remembered that his father had said that his Aunt Martha would probably die with all her wealth intact. James turned from his contemplation of the foggy street, and his blue eyes studied the occupants of the big office. There was Henry Marsh, humped like an old buzzard, his long nose close to the ledger page, as he had been from the first time James had seen him. He had grown old with Mellon and Company, so old that he worried about his job. There were younger men working adding machines, delving in accounts, preparing themselves for a life of drudgery. Over in the cashier's cage was David Conley, frozen-faced, pathetic, as old as Mellon and Company. James shuddered slightly. If he lived to be 70 and worked faithfully, he might occupy that cage. James was being paid the munificent sum of $70 a month. He happened to know that David Conley drew $150 in his monthly envelope. James shook his head and shifted his gaze back to the window. He did not feel like working. It all seemed so useless, this idea of putting down figures and adding them up, eating, sleeping, and coming back to put down more figures. He turned from contemplation of the wet street and looked at Blair Mellon, senior member of the firm, who had come in from his private office. He was nearing 70, thinned, stooped, irascible. Nothing seemed to please him. His beady eyes shifted from one employee to another as he walked slowly. He had made a success of business, but a wreck of himself. The boys of the firm called him Caucus, because of the fact that once a week he would hold a caucus in the office, at which time he would impress upon them the fact that the firm was everything and that nothing else mattered. He would invite suggestions from department heads, and when an idea did not please him, he would fly into a rage. James Eaton Legg mildly suggested at one of the caucuses that the firm supply each bookkeeper with a fountain pen in order to economize on lost motions, and nearly lost his job. Not because of trying to increase the efficiency of the bookkeeping department, but because fountain pens cost money. All the firm mail came to Blair Mellon's office, and it was his delight to distribute it. Just now he had several letters which he was passing out. He walked past James, stopped. James was looking at the street again. The old man scowled at the letters in his hand, one of which was addressed to James Eaton Legg. It bore the imprint of a Chicago law firm. Blair Mellon did not believe that a bookkeeper should waste his time in looking out of the window, but just now he couldn't think of a fitting rebuke. So he placed the letter on James Legg's desk and went on. James Legg's mild blue eyes contemplated the name of the law firm on the envelope. It all looked so very legal that James wondered what it might all mean. He drew out the enclosure and read it carefully. Then he removed his glasses, polished them carefully, and read it again. Then he propounded inelegantly but emphatically, "Well, I'll be damned." Blair Mellon had come back past the desk just in time to hear this exclamation. He stopped short and stared at James. "Mr. Legg," he said curtly, "you evidently forget the rule against profanity in this office." But James Legg ignored everything except his own thoughts. "If that don't beat all, what does?" he queried. Blair Mellon stared aghast. This was downright mutiny. He struggled for the proper words with which to rebuke this young man. "Say, caucus," said James, giving Mellon the nickname he had never heard before. "Where do they raise cattle?" "Were you speaking to me, sir?" demanded Mellon. James realized what he had said, and for a moment his face flushed. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Mellon." "I should think you would, sir. Such language." It seemed that all work had ceased in the office. Not even a telephone bell rang. "Have you any excuse for speaking in such a manner?" demanded the old man, conscious that everyone had heard. James Eaton Legg surveyed the room. Every eye was upon him. He noticed that even the stenographers had ceased chewing their gum. Then James Legg laughed as he drew off his black sateen oversleeves and cast them aside. He slid off his stool almost into the irate Mellon. "Well, sir," the old man's voice creaked. "Save it for somebody that's working for you," said James Legg easily. "I've quit." "Quit?" "Yes, strange, isn't it?" James Legg smiled at the old man. "Bookkeepers don't usually quit, do they? No, they stick to the job until their chin hits their knees, and the undertaker has to put them in a press for 2 days before they'll fit in a casket. I suppose the cashier will pay me off, Mr. Mellon?" "Well, yes, sir. It's just as well that you do quit. This is very, very unusual for an employee of Mellon and Company to quit," smiled James. "Sets a precedent. Ordinarily, we would offer a letter of recommendation, but in the case of couldn't use it. But thank you just the same, Mr. Mellon. I am through keeping books. I'm going to take a job where I can breathe fresh air, smoke a cigarette on the job, and swear when I damn please." The old man's lean jaw set tightly for a moment, but he said icily, "And what are you going to do, if I may ask?" "Me?" James Legg smiled broadly around the room. "I'm going to go be a cowpuncher." "What?" "A cowboy, if that makes it plain to you." One of the stenographers tittered. She had her own idea of a cowboy, possibly not from the real article, so she might be forgiven for seeing humor in Legg's statement. He flushed a little, turned on his heel, and went to the washroom, everyone looking after him. Blair Mellon broke the spell with, "The incident is over, I believe, ladies and gentlemen," which was sufficient to put them all back to work, while James Eaton Legg accepted his pay from the stiff-necked cashier and walked out into the foggy street. He felt just a little weak over it all. It was hard to realize that he was at last without a job. It was the first time in years that he had been without a job, and the situation rather appalled him, and he stopped on a corner, wondering whether he hadn't been just a trifle abrupt in quitting Mellon and Company. But he realized that the die was cast, so he went to his boarding house and to his room, where he secured an old atlas. Spreading out a map on the bed, he studied the western states. Arizona seemed to appeal to him, so he ran a pencil point along the railroad lines, wondering just where in Arizona he would care to make his start. The pencil point stopped at Blue Wells, and he instinctively made a circle around the name. It seemed rather isolated, and James Legg had an idea that it must be cattle country. Something or somebody was making a noise at his door, so he got up from the bed. He opened the door and found out that the noise had been made by a dog, a rough-coated mongrel, yellowish red, with one black eye, which gave him a devil-may-care expression. He was dirty and wet, panting from a hard run, but he sat up and squinted at James Legg, his tongue hanging out. "Where did you come from, dog?" demanded James. "I don't think I have ever seen you before." The dog held up one wet paw, and James shook hands with him solemnly. Came the sound of a heavy voice downstairs, and the dog shot past James and went under the bed. The voice was audible now, and James could distinguish the high-pitched voice of the landlady raised in protest. "But I tell you, I seen him come in here, ma'am," declared the heavy voice. "A kind of a yeller one he was." "But no one in this house owns a dog," protested the landlady. "We don't allow dogs in here." "Don't you? And have you the rules printed in dog language so that the dogs would know it, ma'am? Belike he's in one of the halls trying to hide." "I'm sure you're mistaken, officer, but I'll go with you if you care to make a search of the halls." "I'll do that, ma'am." James closed his door, leaving only a crack wide enough for him to see the landlady, followed by a big burly policeman, come to the head of the stairs. They came past his door, and he heard them farther down the hall. The dog was still under the bed, and as they came back, James stepped into the hall. "We are looking for a yellow dog, Mr. Legg," explained the landlady. "You haven't seen one, have you?" "Sorta yeller and red," supplemented the officer. James shook his head. "Must be an important yellow dog to have the police hunting for him." "He's important to me," growled the officer. "Just a dirty stray, so he is." "But why are you hunting for a stray dog, officer?" "Because he's a dangerous dog. I threw a rock at him, trying to chase him off my beat, and the dirty cur picked up the rock and brought it back to me." "A retriever, eh?" "I don't know his breed." "But that doesn't make him dangerous." "Well, then I took a kick at him, and he bit me, so he did. He tore the leg of me pants, and I had to go home and change. I didn't know more than get back on the beat when there he was, probably looking for another chance at my legs. But I took after him, and I was sure he ran in here." "Well, I'm sure he never did," said the landlady, "but we'll look in the other halls." James went back in the room and found the dog sitting in the middle of the floor, one ear cocked up, his brown eyes fixed on James, his tongue hanging out as if he'd heard all of the conversation and was laughing at the policeman. James held out his hand, and they shook seriously. "Dog," said James seriously, "you did what I've often thought I'd like to do, bite a policeman. I swore out loud in Mellon Company's office, and you bit a cop. We're a disgraceful pair. I'm wondering if you're a cattle dog." James sighed heavily. "Well, anyway, you're as much of a cattle dog as I am a cowpuncher. Sit down and make yourself at home." It was half an hour later that James Eaton Legg walked out of his room carrying a heavy valise, while behind him came the dog, walking carefully, peering around the legs of his newly found master. At the foot of the stairs they met the landlady. She stared at the dog and at James. "That was the dog the policeman was looking for," she exclaimed in a horrified screech. "Don't let him come toward me. You get that dog out of here, Mr. Legg. You know we don't allow dogs in here. Take him." "That dog," said James calmly, "is very particular who he bites, ma'am. If my bill is ready." "Oh, are you leaving us, Mr. Legg?" "Yes'm. Me and Geronimo are leaving. If any mail comes for me, forward it to Jim Legg, Blue Wells, Arizona." "Oh, yes, Blue Wells, Arizona. Are you going out there for your health?" "Well," said Jim Legg as he paid his bill, "I don't just know how it'll affect me physically. It'll probably be a good thing for Geronimo. Give him a change of diet. And for the good of the police force, I suppose I better phone for a taxi." And thus did Jim Legg, erstwhile James Eaton Legg, quit his job, adopt the dog, and start for Blue Wells, just an isolated spot on a map of Arizona, all in the same day. Hey folks, that's the end of episode 1 of the Buckaroo of Blue Wells. We hope you liked it, and if you did, could we please ask you to like, share, and subscribe? This will help us finish the story and bring you more content like it. The Buckaroo of Blue Wells was written by W.C. Tuttle and was first published in Adventure Magazine in 1926. It is in the public domain and can be found online at Gutenberg.org. We ask that you support them too, if you can. Cheers.